All right. The week 9 GPP show with my guy Jmtowin is here. I don't know if everyone heard, but Chalktober is now over and it is GPP Brovember, and it all starts right here with Pete and JM.
Peter's one of the greatest depositors I've ever seen.
Trust the process. Let's go.
I got auto match with Levitan. Bullshit.
I just go the other way. In that 66, I win all the money. All the money.
If I had 150 lineups, I'd win too.
AP, 35 bullets in your head like KD. Bust it, bitch, go bust it. And I had 10 pints with me in Russia.
Hey, everyone.
All right, JM told me this is your flu game. You're battling the elements, the weather conspiring to shut down your internet at a moment notice, but you're going to battle through?
Yeah, this might very well turn into a solo Pete pod. So live podcast, we'll have some interesting. Yeah, we lost power last night, so we all sleep with white noise machines too. And so the kids all woke up at like 12:50 a.m. Like 2:30 a.m. and then power them up again. So that was the night, and then we lost power again this morning. So we will see how things go. But we're up and running right now. So we'll make hay while the sun is not shining, I guess, and have some fun.
Yes, we will get through this. And if JM's power goes out, you guys are stuck with me for a solo stream, as if you guys don't get enough of that already. So we'll cross our fingers that that's not the case. JM, I know, to do a little circling back on the previous week, the GPP bros down very bad. The chalk keeps hitting. It's unrelenting. I think I was listening. I don't know if it was your Winner's Circle podcast, one of the early week podcasts you did, where you had a similar take that I do, which is like, yes, because it's all in the rearview mirror right now, there's a recency bias to it. And yet when you look at small sample sizes in the way things actually going, that there isn't actually a new trend that's making chalk better this year than it is in previous years.
No, this question's asked every 3-4 years, right? Every 3-4 years, people are not every 3-4 years, over the last 3-4 years, people have been like, oh, like chalk always hits down. It's because projection systems are sharper and chalk is sharp. And it's like, really this topic has been a topic for a while. And also if you're playing tournaments and you don't have some chalky pieces, you're probably doing things wrong anyway. Most weeks, there's certain weeks where the chalk is bad chalk. There's certain weeks where the guys who are chalk, because of the way that the slate shapes up, the guys who are chalk that week would be completely unowned in other weeks. And it's just like, well, we don't know who to play, and chalk forms no matter what. And so chalk forms around certain guys. But generally speaking, like last week, Alan Kamara was a great play. Derrick Henry was a great play. Christian McCaffrey was low owned, but was a great play. Tony Pollard was a great play and actually ended up being a bad play that hit, right? He had 15 touches, but scored 3 touchdowns, bailed out everybody who played him. But no, I mean, realistically, you have to understand one of the things I talked about today in the Angles podcast, if you try to get, I'm going to super condense this, right? DraftKings generally prices players so that they hit 4x their salary once every 4 games. There are a lot of nuances here, but generally speaking, that's what DraftKings does. The math on that's just to get you to 200 plus points. The math on getting 9 different players right, who all are going to score 4x 25% of the time, you would do that once out of every 264,000 rosters. So we always want to be looking for ways to lower that number for ourselves. One of the ways we can do that is correlation. If we correlate 2 players where, hey, look, if this guy hits, this other guy is also hitting, well, now we lower our number from once out of every 264,000 rosters to one out of every 66,000 rosters, just with that one move. But another way we can do that is players who are going to hit more often than once out of every 4 times in this particular spot. So like Alvin Kamara last week was going to hit for a big game more than once out of every 4 times in that spot, with what his role had been, with where his price tag was, with the touchdown regression we were waiting on. And so rather than saying, oh, I'm going to outmaneuver everybody who's playing this guy, you could say, oh, okay, I'll just play this guy and be different somewhere else. And so there's a lot that goes into putting together sharp rosters plus EV rosters. And it's rarely about just avoiding chalk players or playing chalk players. It's about how you put those rosters together. So I think that the whole discussion about, it's like a red herring, this whole discussion of, oh, is chalk sharper now? Should we be playing more chalk? It's like, you should almost always be playing some chalk. And it's not even about the individual players. It's about how you put your rosters together to turn the math in your favor so that you're hitting more often than once out of every 266,000 times. So that if you're building 150 rosters in a weekend, you should have several of those rosters scoring 200 plus points every single week, right? So if the average player taking 9 random pieces would do it once out of every 266,000 rosters, we or one out of every 264,000, whatever it is, we can be like, cool, you guys do that. We'll be over here doing this, 3, 4, 5 out of every 150 rosters over time, maybe even 8 or 10 times out of every 150 rosters. And so, I think the whole discussion it kind of throws people off the scent of what really matters. And it's fun to talk about. It's fun to like touch on and work through because that's what's on people's minds. But I think realistically, that's not the focus. And I think people are getting distracted with that.
Yeah. And again, too, and I remember this, I was beating myself up over a Rashad Penny play a few weeks back where he ended up coming in, it was like 35% or 40%.
Yeah, where he was projected at like 6% when came in super high owned.
And I was like, people were so confused of why I would say like, yeah, I was unhappy with that play because I was so off on how popular I think he was going to be. And same thing with the Pollard thing. Like most people would say, JM, you were crazy to say he was a bad play, but based on his touches in that ownership relative to the other options you had on the slate that projected for more, like he was a bad play. If we knew, like if I told you his workload, you would say, I am not playing a guy playing 50% of the snaps this week.
If you told me on Saturday, listen, I talked to Mike McCarthy, they're going to give him 14 carries and 1 catch, and that's it. And he's going to be 50% owned on DraftKings. I'd be like, well, that's easy, right? You literally would never play. Nobody who had that information would play that guy unless they don't understand DFS, right? Yeah, sometimes guys get multiple touchdowns. I had Pollard. Like Pollard was a focus for me last week, right? But that I can look at that objectively and be like, oh wow, I like playing Pollard. You got lucky that he scored the touchdowns because his role wasn't what we expected it to be. And even I said, like, oh, I expect the Cowboys to give more touches. What was it, Malik Davis? I expect the Cowboys to give more touches to Malik Davis than we're expecting. But I still expected Pollard to get, about 20 touches with like 4 or 5 or 6 catches, which is a totally different way for that to play out than 1 catch and 14 carries. By the way, is that LaCroix that you drink? Because I feel like that's super hipsterish.
Is it?
Isn't
LaCroix was a little
LaCroix.
Okay, now that's hipsterish. That's hipsterish pronunciation. I thought this was pretty mainstream at this point, Jam.
Maybe at this point, I don't know. I know like 2 years ago that was how it started. Was very, very hipster driven. I mean, pickleball is pretty mainstream at this point, isn't it?
God, please don't ever compare my precious
their case of LaCroix on their pickleball court.
Just drinking a little LaCroix, talking about whether chalk is hitting at an outsized rate.
My brother-in-law ordered a bullet bourbon at a restaurant one time, and the waiter corrected him and said "Boulet," which is inaccurate but hilarious.
Well, on a note too, here, kind of talking about varying slates and how chalk can either condense or get spread out. Jason had a question here. He says, why does JM say I'll take all the 10 game slates? Strategy or less work? Yeah, going through all the games could be a piece of it. But what do you mean
also
by that?
Less work? Also less work. Yeah, those are kind of nice. But the thought behind it was fewer options. It just becomes a little bit easier to work through things. In MLB, I always preferred the 7 to 9 game slates. NFL, if we can get down to a 9 game slate, which is rare, I like those. But yeah, these 9, 10, 11 game slates, I just like them more than the 13 game slates. Obviously, everybody has fewer options, but I feel like the fewer options we have, the more I'm able to kind of sharpen my game at a higher rate than other people can.
Yeah. I like that too. And it does feel like, because, regardless of how good the slate is, like one thing when you're talking about like good chalk versus bad chalk, like there is going to be a cash game lineup. There is going to be an optimal lineup by projections that a lot of people who play that specific style or game types are going to play. And so they're going to have that regardless of whether there's quote good chalk, whether there's a ton of players projecting for points or not a lot. I tend to like those weeks too, where it's more thinned out. And it's like, these guys are going to play these guys, and maybe they're making thinner plays than they would ideally like to make. But just because of the slate dynamics, they're forced to play someone there.
I was looking at Aaron Rodgers before I looked at ownership projections as like a guy who I was like, man, he's probably going to be 3 or 4% owned. No one really wants to play him, but he can actually still pass for 250 yards and 4 touchdowns in this spot. And so I'll probably, this week I'm playing multi-entry and limited entry. So basically, like, I'll still have a main build, high dollar build. but then also have like 100 plus large field rosters. So I was thinking like maybe like a small percentage of my large field rosters, I'll have some Aaron Rodgers and be kind of sneaky there. And then I looked at ownership projections this morning. We currently have him at 9.2%. These are early ownership projections that'll change, but it's like, that's the kind of week that it is where people are like, well, we know that the Packers play slow. We know they want to run the ball. We know they can run the ball against Detroit. And yet, who else do I go to? Well, I'll go to Aaron Rodgers, right? He can hit. And on a typical week, nobody wants to play Aaron Rodgers. Now, again, Detroit is always a game environment that can go off, so it makes sense. But it's you wouldn't think of Aaron Rodgers as a guy that 1 out of every 10 rosters would want to have in a tournament. And that's kind of the week that it is. And that's not to pick on the Aaron Rodgers play. I'll still have it, but I won't be expanding my exposure to it. I'll still have it on like 3-4% of my builds. And now apparently it'll be on 10% of the field. And so, yeah, I think weeks like this, projection that everybody kind of has the same projection systems and everybody pays attention to the same guys. And so if the same, like Levitan, we know is one of the sharpest cash game players, whoever he's uncovering, then those are going to be sharp plays. And we know a lot of DFS content providers who are playing NBA every day are going to read what Levitan says and then be like, okay, this is sharp. Let me talk about this. And then the same, like the Blitz and a few other projection systems are all going to be used by a lot of the people who are providing content. And so there is going to be, like you said, that cash game lineup that bleeds over to tournament play. And the cash game lineup on a week like this might be guys that on a different week people just wouldn't really be on.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring up Rodgers too, and that kind of reminds me to last week with Derrick Henry, right? Where it's like everyone knows the Texans' run defense is awful. I thought early on in the week he was going to be like 40% owned, like everyone was just going to jam him. But then because so many people now rely on projection systems, and we had so many good points per dollar plays at the running back position, Derrick Henry wasn't even that crazy owned. I think he was like 17, 18% in a lot of contests like that. And Rodgers in the same spot, right? Like everyone would be pulling down their flow chart, being like Detroit Lions pass defense, like what more do you have to tell me? But people can look at the projections. They think of the struggles that Aaron Rodgers has had this year and might find ways to not roster him as high of a clip as they used to.
Yeah, absolutely. And so a week like this is interesting. I said in the Angles podcast this morning that usually I take that podcast and kind of break down the macro view of the slate. So last week it was like the macro view was like, hey, there's like 12 good running backs, but some of them are higher variance than others. And so if we can just get the 3 or 4 running backs who are likeliest to hit on our rosters, get the sharp running backs on our rosters. And then there's only, there's all these low total games and 3 games with higher totals. So if only one of those hits for like a 70th percentile outcome, that becomes the game you had to have. That was kind of like the macro of last week's slate. This week, I built way more practice rosters than I normally have by this point in the week. I've written up my DFS interpretations. I've prepared the player grid. And I'm like, oh, I don't really know how I would define this slate, which is kind of like the definition of this slate is it's just kind of this weird nebulous slate where there's some games here and some games there and some decent players, but nothing that's like, oh, this is how this slate shapes up and this is how we should be approaching it, or this is our clear edge, which means that our clear edge is just better roster construction than everybody else. And there's 100 different ways to do that, to build plus EV roster. So on a week like this, I would worry less about what games am I attacking and what players am I attacking, and more about just sound DFS theory, because that's what's going to win the day on a slate like this.
Yeah, and I would say the only other kind of unique element to this slate relative to previous is that we do only have 2 4 p.m. games, which I feel like in the past few weeks we've had lots of kind of good options, for late swaps and maneuvering your lineups around. But this week, just Seattle, Arizona, and the Rams, Tampa Bay. There's not going to be as much to maneuver to depending on how things go at 1 p.m.
Yeah, you could certainly have some Seattle, Arizona, and know that that'll be popular. And if your rosters look dead, nobody's going to be on the Rams and Bucks, which is crazy to say after the way those games went last year. But like a 42.5 total this week. That's an interesting spot as well.
So you mentioned, this slate feeling unique. When I look at the implied team totals, we have Buffalo up there at the top, projected to score almost 30 points. And then we have basically, 5 other teams projected to score over 25: Miami, Cincinnati, Arizona, Green Bay, and the Chargers. And you can go through all of those games, all of those teams, and poke holes in them, tell yourself ways that they fail. Are you kind of thinking this is another week where I want to try to identify that one game where it goes 60, 70 points and helps me win a GPP? Or are you kind of thinking this might be a pick your spots type of slate?
Not necessarily a pick your spots, but I don't think that, as in, it's not going to be like, oh, I've got a player from this game and a player from this game and a player from this game and a player from this game. But I don't think that this is a week where you necessarily need the game environment, because it could be a week where nothing really pops, right? Like the Bills are implied, you said almost 30 points, and that's key here because it actually was 30 points at the beginning of the week, and then it dropped to 29-7-5 and then 29-5, and now it's at last I looked, it was 28-7-5 because they're on the road against this really good Jets defense. And realistically, they're still the Bills. They're still going to score points, but you have these high price tags on Josh Allen, on Steph Diggs, and their total is dropping. It's a tough spot, right? And then you have these other spots where basically the teams that can kind of end up in this higher range are more expensive. But then you also have teams like spots like Taylor Heineke and Terry McLaurin. That's interesting. Against Minnesota, they have a very low implied team total, and so people aren't going to think about that. But that's a game with, last I looked, 43.5 point total. But it's a game where if we say, yeah, maybe 50% of the time it finishes below that number. But when it finishes above that number, it's not always going to finish at 45, 46. If Minnesota takes off against that Washington pass defense, this is the sort of game that could finish 35-31, right? This is the sort of game that could be high scoring. We also have Trevor Lawrence in a spot against a good game where Evan Ingram or one of those other wide receivers could put up a big game. Travis Etienne is going to be popular this week, is a very sharp play. So there's some of these cheaper options, right? Justin Fields looks great right now, and you can play Justin Fields in some interesting ways. Marcus Mariota is down there at 5,300 and can obviously hit opposite Justin Herbert. And there's a viable path to Justin Herbert producing because of his weapons being so cheap this week, right? If we assume Keenan Allen's going to be out, we know that Mike Williams is going to be out, and now it's like Donald Parham's going to be out. So this offense that a lot of times spreads the ball out. Well, now it's like, who are they going to give the ball to? DeAndre Carter is going to be on the field every snap. Josh Palmer is going to be on the field every snap. Gerald Everett is trusted. Austin Eckler is trusted. Well, there's not a lot that they can spread things out to beyond that. They'll find ways because they're the Chargers, but it's viable that like Palmer could hit for a huge game. Carter could hit for a huge game alongside Eckler without Herbert putting up 32, 33, 34 points, right? So Herbert could score 26. On the opposite side of that game, Marcus Mariota could put up 25 points. So there are just a lot of interesting ways that we can play around with this slate. And I guess I'll say break some rules, which I love doing because the rules are always, hey, if we take this huge sample size of all the NFL games over the last 5 years, these are the things that are highest EV. These are the things that work most often, but every unique situation is unique. And so if we can find ways to break rules where it makes sense to break them, other people won't be breaking those rules. So yeah, there's just a lot that I like about this slate. In one of Hilo's write-ups, DFS interpretations, or maybe it was an NFL Edge write-up, he said something about this ugly slate. And I was like, oh, really? I didn't know that that's how we were like looking at this slate, because I just I guess it is an ugly slate, right? But there's just some really unique components that I like about the way it shapes up and the way that we can put rosters together on this slate.
I wanted to bring something up you mentioned too, because I know another hot topic conversation around the GPP water cooler this year has been the idea of bringbacks. And I'm kind of curious, when you think about your building blocks, and we always, every week on this show, build our DFS lineup with one of JM's favorite building blocks. The rest of them are available on 1 week season later on the weekend. So you guys can always check that out, and highly recommend getting over there. You can get 40% off the OWS Inner Circle and DFS packages with promo code Pete, or you could try a weekly pass for 20% off with, Pete 40 for the 40 and code Pete for the 1 week. But with those blocks, how are you thinking about bringbacks and this idea of, I want this entire game to go off, therefore the opponent, I want a piece of that, or I'm not going to force it? I realize there's all kinds of contextual issues for each situation, but just kind of in general, how do you think about bringbacks vis-a-vis your block concept?
I think of bringbacks as something that most people do automatically. And therefore, if we can find places where the bringback isn't actually correlated, we gain an edge. So what I mean by that is, let's go back to what we were talking about, like 1 out of every 264,000 rosters, right? And if we say that, okay, every time that Terry McLaurin hits, Taylor Heineke's also going to hit. So if we play Terry McLaurin, let's also play Taylor Heineke. Well, now that gives us 8 things we need to get right. And that becomes 1 out of every 66,000 rosters that we could just get 8 random things right, because we've turned this one bet in these 2 bets into one bet. And that's the power of correlation. And so Travis Kelce, we've talked about Travis Kelce this year on this show. Travis Kelce, every time he hits for like 23, 24 plus points, Patrick Mahomes is also hitting. So sure, there's viability to playing Kelce and like a cheap quarterback. And there's going to be weeks where Kelce hits, Mahomes hits, and another expensive quarterback hits even higher. But just mathematically, it doesn't make sense to try to find that other quarterback who hits higher, because you're getting this other spot right. You're turning these 2 bets into one by putting Kelce on your roster. So take advantage of that. The math tells you to take advantage of that. So when we think of correlation as being that powerful in that way, right? That's the starting point. And then we have ways where it's like, maybe it doesn't mean, hey, I get this guy right, and so I definitely get this other guy right. But there are spots where it's like, okay, I get this guy right. And so now instead of it being maybe a 25% chance of this guy hitting, it becomes a 50% chance of this other guy hitting, right? This guy hits, and therefore this other guy is more likely to hit. That's the other form of correlation. And then there's other correlation where it's like, I played this guy, and oh, look, here's this other guy who I also kind of like, who's in the same game on the other team. So let me play this guy. And it's really not correlated at all. And so even in a lot of these stacks where it's like one of the things that Squirrel Patrol and I talked about last week on our solo ship show on Roto Grinders was that the power of concentrated offenses. So the Dolphins are a team, and we went through this in the Winner Circle podcast, of like Waddle and Hill combined for 20 catches last week. And then like everybody else combined for, I don't know, 6 or 7 catches. It's a massively concentrated offense. And so when you have a concentrated offense, you know where the ball is going. That's great. Just because these guys on a concentrated offense are hitting doesn't mean that somebody on the offense on the other side is also hitting, because the offense on the other side might be more spread out, and the Dolphins might win in like a 28-17 game or 35-17 game. And so, yeah, any place where I can find a spot where people are just going to auto push the button. It's like, okay, I got these guys, and so let me also bring back these guys. And especially in high dollar tournaments, because a lot of people in high dollar tournaments are really sharp players who understand the deeper concepts of DFS, but they're also playing all the different sports. And so they go through their NFL stuff, and it's like, okay, I've got this stack, and so I've got this bring back. And it's like any place where we can find it where those bring backs aren't as correlated as people think, I want to take advantage of that. So I'm always going to have a bring back less often than other people are going to have a bring back, which is a funny way to say that sentence, because I said I'm always going to have a bring back. I'm always going to have a bring back less often than everybody else. But yeah, so that's kind of how I look at it, is any place where people just assume that okay, we'll do a bring back here. I want to look at the math and be like, does these guys hitting actually mean that these guys are significantly more likely to hit? Or is it just kind of feel good to put this guy on a roster?
Right. Yeah. And I that it's been putting my head in a pretzel a little bit as I think through it. I would, last week on my main team, I had a Jalen Hurts double stack with AJ Brown in Dallas Goedert, and I brought it back with Chase Claypool. And again, my thought being, hey, these Eagles, like, they do need to be pushed. They take their feet off the gas in the second quarter for them to succeed. And then hilariously, that's exactly what happened, but it didn't matter because they got all their points. I was pretty happy with the score that those guys had in the first half, with AJ Brown scoring 3 touchdowns.
Yeah.
And it makes me think too of pushing, like, I'd almost rather be in one direction or the other. It's like, okay, I clearly feel good about this spot for the Eagles, just play the Eagles. Or I feel so good about this game that it's not just a bring back, I'm also going to toss in Deontay Johnson or whatever. And so it's like, I'd rather be on the extremes of like, game stack this or just play the side of the offense you like.
Yeah, I think that's great. And by the way, shout out to you on that Eagle stack. That was a super sharp way to approach the slate last week, getting that AJ Brown stack in there. And then you get those 113 yards in the first half, and you're like, all right, let's keep it going. And he gets what did he get? 43 yards in the second half. I took the Thursday Night Football. I took the second half over of like 36.5 yards for him, and he got like 22 yards because they're just like, hey, we don't have to do anything in the second half. And that was with they were tied going into halftime in that one. Yeah. So the game environments is like a totally different thing. And that's where you're saying, hey, maybe this game as a whole blows up. I think what was interesting in that, we won't get too deep into it because it's obviously behind the Inner Circle paywall, but in that Winner Circle podcast, the question that inspired that conversation was somebody had asked about Osimo's small field roster from last week that had 4 Dolphins and no bring back. And to me, that's something like we broke down why it made so much sense, right? Because the Dolphins are a concentrated offense, and we know how hard it is to get 9 things right. So you're probably not getting all 4 of those Dolphins right. But by putting 4 of them on there, you're probably getting 3 right if the Dolphins have a nice game. So then you're just saying, look, I don't care. Like now I just need to get 5 other spots right. I'll take 3 out of 4 over here. But for me, like I would typically in a situation like that, I would be like, oh, okay, got to get the bring back because I have 4 guys here and I'm clearly betting on the game environment. And what was interesting on that roster was, again, it was smaller field contest, but it was basically like when we broke down what you would have to sacrifice somewhere else on the roster, we had defined the week as you probably want to play 3 running backs. You've got to get 3 guys who can hit, and you got to get the game environment right. Well, that roster had Dante Foreman, it had Tony Pollard, and it had Raheem Mostert as part of this Dolphin stack. And so you can't sacrifice that. And there was nowhere else to sacrifice salary. And so basically it was going to be like significantly weakening one of the other theses on the roster in order to force in Amon-Ra St. Brown, who probably in that game environment is still only going to get 4x his salary. And so it was a super sharp way to put it together of like, okay, no Amon-Ra St. Brown, just 4 Dolphins. But yeah, a spot like that where you're clearly betting on the game environment, I'm typically going to monkey brain it and be like, well, then you've got to have the piece from the other side. I think most people would, but I'm not averse to taking 3 guys and then just being like, cool, like does these 3 guys hitting definitely mean that somebody on the other side is hitting? And effectively that's what that roster was. It was taking 3 guys because you're probably not getting all 4 guys to hit, but because it's a concentrated offense, you can probably get 3 of these guys to hit. And so then you're like, well, I don't need the bring back. I'm betting on getting 3 of these guys right.
And I do think sometimes looking at the winning Millie Maker or like the perfect optimal lineup on the week is a good illustrator of this. The winning Millie Maker lineup last week had a Tua double with Tyreek and Waddle with no bringbacks. And it wasn't that those were bad plays or overstacking. It was the math literally wouldn't allow it. When you had so many value plays like Garrett Wilson and DJ Moore smashing their salary, it's like those guys necessarily had to be in the optimal lineup. And you can that helps me kind of untangle it in my head of like, the math just might not make a bring back work out. And then you have to really ask yourself, I'm sacrificing projected points or ceiling or a 5x multiplier here to get the correlation. The correlation's worth something, but how much is it worth?
Yeah. This is a great conversation. And I think that we're like 4 layers down, right? In DFS strategy and play. And so we're like our broadest competition is on layer 1. And then it feels great when you start getting to layer 2 and layer 3 and you're like, oh wow, I've never scored 200 plus points before. And now I've done it multiple times this season. And we see that a lot with people coming to OWS. And we've even seen, I'm sure you listened to the Angles podcast where like our bottom up build contest where we have a 44K salary cap. Most weeks people are scoring 200 plus points at a 44K salary cap because we're understanding better than the field, how to put rosters together. And then understanding better than the field leverage and how to clear out our paths to a first place finish. But then there's still like, we also have to understand that being smarter than 95% of the field doesn't get us to first place. So we still have to know that there's still steps to take to get to first place. And some of these things are really valuable to talk about and think about because they're kind of new steps for us, right? Where it's like, okay, and maybe we can have this stack and not have the bring back because like you said, the correlation is worth something, but is it worth as much as having this best roster across the board? Right now I've got to go down to like the super cheap wideout in order to make something else work, or I've got to sacrifice one of these 3 running backs in order to make something else work. And that roster that we were just talking about with Osmo, like it had Noah Fant, it had the cheapest tight end you could really get down to. It had the cheapest defense you could really get down to. So there weren't a lot of places to sacrifice outside of breaking up the whole approach to the roster. So yeah, I think that's really sharp. And just thinking about anytime we can break it down to raw numbers, it helps us to understand things better. And so even things like that, hey, 1 out of every 264,000 is how a lot of people play DFS. And we're trying to play DFS like 1 out of every 100 rosters should be able to score 200 plus points. And then thinking about like, okay, the math just might not make it work sometimes for the correlation to be the best way to do things. And so, yes, correlation on the other side of a game is powerful and valuable, but not always the thing to do there. And there's other things that you can do instead.
Awesome. Yeah. Let's start to dig in a little bit to the slate. Of course, in a second, we will build a lineup using building blocks, but just some other kind of macro thoughts about kind of how we're feeling about week 9. I mean, one thing I normally always do before the show, I like to kind of run the optimals and just see what kind of stuff is popping up. And this week was interesting because 3 of the top lineups all had 3 different quarterbacks in it, which was weird to me because normally you'll see one quarterback like 80% showing up. It's Tua or whoever. This week, you guys saw Josh Allen in one, Marcus Mariota in one, Geno Smith in one. Are you kind of getting the feeling that at quarterback, we already talked about Rodgers a little bit, that it might be a really spread out week there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I already mentioned Herbert, Fields, Mariota, Lawrence, Heineke, Aaron Rodgers, like as all guys that I will have on builds this week. I've built some Geno rosters already this week. So yeah, it's a week where, and that's what I kind of like about this week. It's a harder week for single entry to really get down to like one build, but it's a great week for large field play because even if you're building 20 rosters, 30 rosters, to be able to say, okay, well, here are you want to have some things that are on a lot of your rosters, right? So whatever your bets are that you're like I'll probably have Travis Etienne on every roster this week. It's dangerous to say that on Friday because then if I end up shifting my thinking and maybe he's like on 20% of my rosters and people are like, JM lied to me on Friday. But so understand, like I might change that. But before I looked at ownership, like Tuesday, Wednesday, I was like, okay, this is the guy who I'll probably play on every roster. So now if I get that one bet right, I'm down to just needing 8 things right across the entire slate, right? And so you want to have some spots like that, or generally speaking, you want to have some spots that you're way overweight on, and it's not always going to be the quarterback position. So this week for me, there's a few things that I'm going to do pretty consistently. I'll have a Chargers player on every roster because I think that they can hit for big games against Atlanta, and they're underpriced. Or generally underpriced, and Eckler just has this huge role. So I'll have a Chargers player on almost every roster. I'll have Etienne on almost every roster as of right now. But then that allows me to say, okay, here are the spots where I'm staying consistent, and then quarterback and stacks is where I'm kind of mixing and matching. Whereas another week, you might say, okay, I'm only playing 3 quarterbacks, and I'm playing them these different ways, and I'll mix and match other pieces. So yeah, for me this week, quarterback is kind of a place where things are really spread out, which is part of why this is such an interesting week.
Yeah, and running back was pretty interesting too. When I was updating my sheet earlier this morning, there were 7 running backs that all projected for the highest ceiling and coincidentally all had the highest ownership. So 7 kind of locked and loaded plays. Since then, we've had Jonathan Taylor ruled out, opening up Deion Jackson. We've had Chuba Hubbard ruled out, opening up Deontay Foreman. And that doesn't even include some of these other interesting plays like Antonio Gibson without McKissick. Is this week feeling just as wide open for you at running back outside of ETN, who it sounds like you have guaranteed you will have in 110% of your roster?
Yeah, I've guaranteed it. The JM Friday guarantee. Now, I think he and Eckler are in a different tier than the other running backs. And maybe Jacobs is in like a 1B tier, and then there are a lot of other really sharp running backs that I would say like a 1C tier, in that I'm not putting him in like a number 2 tier. These are all good plays. I do think if we played out this slate 100 times, then getting those 2 guys on a lot of your rosters would be optimal. But we get to play out this slate once, and there are a lot of other running backs who are close to those guys. So I'll certainly be like in large field play, I'll be considering those guys. And even in small field play, I will be messing around with different way. Like on my main build, I'm not just definitely going to have Eckler and Etienne. I'm going to have like mix and match some different things to see how I want to play things and pull things off. But yeah, running back's definitely wide open. I wouldn't say as wide open as last week, where I was like, I had 4 guys and I was like, I can't play all 4 guys. Remember fantasy draft where you had 2 flex spots? Yeah. And it was like that would have been the week for that because I wanted to play McCaffrey last week too. And so I would have been like, let me get McCaffrey and Derrick Henry and Alvin Kamara and Tony Pollard onto a build together. This week, it's less like that. I'm like, there's 2 guys that I really want, and I might not have Eckler everywhere. I probably won't have him everywhere because there's other Chargers I want as well. But yeah, there's a lot of other guys that also, it's like, if I'm missing out on Eckler, I'm not like, oh God, what am I going to do? I'm like, okay, this other guy, like Eckler could end up not scoring touchdowns, put up 22 or 24 points. And this guy could put up 28 to 30 at a lower price tag. So there's certainly plenty of ways to approach running back this week.
And it does seem like the same old story at wide receiver here, as far as it being pretty tough to find value deep down. You did mention some of the Chargers guys. Zay Jones looked like he's going to be fairly popular at 4,100. Is this another week for you where it's pretty tough to find those cheap punt wide receivers to unlock some stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. And so then you go to the guys like one of the things Cubs fan would always text me about was who's on the field. Like, what is this guy's role? Is he on the field a lot? Like Terrace Marshall is going to be on the field most of the plays. Tyquan Thornton is going to be on the field most of the plays. Van Jefferson will probably be on the field 70% of the plays after 55% last week. So then you have these guys who it's like, we don't look at them as a viable play or as like a projectable play, but they're on the field a lot. And because they're on the field a lot, they can score 15 to 20 points. So yeah, that's kind of what wide receivers like. Regarding Zay Jones, Mike Johnson texted Zandamir this morning in our group text and asked him about Zay Jones ownership. And Zandamir said, like, he's one of these guys who projects well. So he comes up high in ownership projections early in the week, but most people won't actually click that button. And so ownership projections on him will go lower as the week goes on. But basically it was like, hey, he projects well and there's not a lot of value at wide receiver. And so he just pops randomly as like a high owned guy. And again, probably won't actually be as high owned as he looks right now. But as we move deeper into the weekend, that industry-wide ownership will lower a little bit, and other people will find other guys that they can play at wide receiver. But absolutely, that's the shape of wide receiver this week is, below 5K, it's a little bit ugly. And that's, in a sense, that's kind of great, right? Because then we can say, hey, maybe this guy can't, like the Tyquan Thorntons, the Marquise Goodwins, the Khalif Raymonds, maybe this guy can go for 20 points and nobody's going to be on him.
The top end of the wide receivers are interesting too. Everyone loves Tyreek. It sounds like Cooper Kupp's going to be fine with his injury. Everyone loves DeAndre Hopkins. I've been told, JM, I know you're willing to get your hand in the dirt here a bit. Do I need to be worried about Stephon Diggs' individual matchup this week at cornerback? I've been told I need to worry about it.
I don't know. Should get my hand in the dirt. There's so many variables on something like that, right? Like Sauce Gardner is probably a top 5 cornerback right now. We've also had other young cornerbacks who were top 5 cornerbacks early on and then got exposed by a guy like Stephon Diggs. Realistically, though, just the entire structure of the Jets defense makes this a tough matchup. Like, is Stephon Diggs going to score 28 to 30? He might. Honestly, right? Is he going to score 12 to 14? He might, honestly. Is Stephon Diggs going to score 35 to 38? I would be shocked if he scores like well over 30. And so I'm 0% concerned about missing out on him. Am I concerned about missing out on Tyreek Hill? Yeah, like a little bit, right? Because he can put up 40 without anything else in the game environment working in his favor. And the Bears got rid of Robert Quinn, got rid of Roquan Smith, which just makes the matchup as a whole easier on the Dolphins. So Stephon Diggs, I won't be playing him, and I won't be scared that he'll bury me for not playing him. At the same time, if he goes out and puts up 26 points, I'm not going to be like, God, how did that happen? I didn't see that coming. It'll be like, yeah, he's Stephon Diggs, like he's playing against a rookie cornerback. And like, it's not like Sauce is going to be on him every single play. There's so much that happens in an NFL game where wide receivers are being moved around, defenses are doing different things, zone coverage, man coverage. So yeah, I mean, I think it's not a great matchup. It wouldn't surprise me if he puts up a solid score, but I won't be on the Bills offense at all this week with their total dropping. And actually the Jets are one of my favorite cheap defenses, which doesn't mean I expect them to score double-digit points, but I expect them to get 6, 7, 8 points at $2K in salary, and they open up a lot. So I'll be off the Bills this week, but it won't surprise me if Diggs has 25, 28 points. Won't surprise me if Josh Allen has 30 points, just because that's who they are. I mean, they're so good.
Yeah, they are. And it's also interesting, when you look at the top end wide receivers, I mean, by far the worst points per dollar play there in the top 20 plays is Gabe Davis, 6,900, never going to project well. But I do think if the thesis is, hey, the Bills could score a lot of points and Stephon Diggs could have a rough game against the top corner, Gabe Davis should probably be carrying a little bit more ownership than he's projected to.
Gabe Davis is like Will Fuller back in the day, right?
Yeah.
Did Will Fuller die? Did his finger injury get infected and did he die?
He's officially on the NFL website. He's listed as retired, even though I didn't actually see any confirmation of that.
So wild, man.
Yeah.
Teams could use him. The Packers could use him. Anyhow, Will Fuller, where it's like, if Gabe Davis had a week where he's projected at 25% owned, you probably don't want to play him. And I pulled that number out because there was the week where Will Fuller was 25% owned and scored 50 plus points very randomly, right? Like he actually hit when everybody was on him. But Will Fuller was a guy who was always like, is he under 5% owned? Then consider him. Gabe Davis is kind of the same way, although much more expensive because he's rarely going to get more than 5-6 targets. but he can score from anywhere on the field. We saw it against Pittsburgh, and even that week, nobody played him. And even the next week, nobody played him. Like, people don't want to play Gabe Davis at this high price tag because we're all too sharp. We all know, like, well, he gets so few targets. He can break your roster if he misses, but he can also break the slate if he hits. So Gabe Davis is kind of always in the mix for me.
All right. Before we head into our block party here and build a lineup, why don't you let people know what do you guys got going on over at OWS these days? We still got the 40% off going. You guys have been crushing the prop street, both NFL and NBA. Anything else people should know about over in your neck?
Yeah, actually, one important announcement is that we are bumping up the price of NBA props on Tuesday. So if you have not gotten into the props package yet, and you're interested in it, or if you've done the week pass and you have not gotten into the full season pass, the full season price is going up on Tuesday. So it's going up to $4.99. It is $2.99 right now. That's worth getting into. And then, yeah, Peak 40 takes 40% off. If you want to wait till next week, we'll probably have a new discount next week. But why wait till next week? Go jump in this week and make some money. Get a subscription or take 20% off with promo code Pete off of just a week pass.
Yep. As I mentioned every week, reading through the scroll specifically on Saturday nights is one of my favorite ways to get prepped for the slate. You get JM's full player grid, the rest of the building blocks that we won't get to today, all kinds of other game theory thoughts, MME pool from Sonic, all kinds of good stuff to get you in the right frame of mind for building lineups. And to get us in the right frame of mind, it's time for my building blocks transition. All right, we are now in the mood. We got the Tetris theme. I will leave my Jezball references, lost to the sands of time. I should also mention Deposit Kingdom Weekly League. We have JM, I did it, 420 entries.
420.
My DraftKings rep didn't even give me a chuckle when I suggested it. He just said, here you go.
On brand.
Very mature. Yes. So fire up a doobie, take a huge rip from your bong, and enter this rake-free contest. The link to this is posted in the Deposit Kingdom Discord. The link to the Discord is down below. It's like breadcrumbs, just Hans and Gretel leading you to this rake-free link. And then if you win, if you have a lineup in the top 10, you will receive all the glory, all the clout as I review the contest on Monday mornings. But JM, tell me where we're going to start here. What's our building block? You told me a few before the show, and a couple of them were very interesting to me.
Yeah, so you selected one that I really like. So this is for small field play, not super small field play, and I'll have some of it in large field play, but basically like contest, a couple thousand entries or below is where this is most optimal. But it's certainly viable in large field play, and it's viable in large field play from a standpoint of this probably doesn't win you a tournament, but points in the pocket are great to have, and 4x points in the pocket are great to have. And that block is Josh Jacobs plus Davante Adams. And we look at this as a very unique block where it's like, wait, don't these guys take away points from each other? Or why do you not have Derek Carr on this? Or do you need some Jacksonville pieces? And obviously I'll probably have some Jacksonville pieces on some of these Jacobs and Adams blocks because of Travis Etienne and because of Evan Ingram and Trevor Lawrence and some different ways I'll be approaching this game. But here's the great thing about this is the offense right now. Well, JM, last week it wasn't the offense. Matt Collins had a bunch of targets. So one of the things that was interesting last week was midweek, I was really like, man, Davante Adams, nobody's going to be on him, and he can break the slate. Everybody wants to be on Tyreek Hill at 200 less. And maybe I'll play a bunch of Davante Adams this week. And then as we got deeper into the weekend and he missed the Thursday practice had already missed Wednesday and then missed Thursday, they were calling it significant flu. And I was thinking back to the summer when my wife and I had COVID, and like a week and a half after we recovered, our bodies still felt awful. And I was saying to her, like all the time when NFL players come back from illnesses, we always just assume they're going to step onto the field and be themselves. And you realize like a lot of times their bodies are racked, they're drained of energy, significant flu. More than likely, Davante Adams was in rough shape on Sunday. He actually still missed practice or was limited in practice on Wednesday with this illness. And so Davante Adams was not himself last week, and we saw what that did to the entire offense. It collapsed the entire offense, right? So my interest by Saturday in Davante Adams, Josh Jacobs had largely evaporated because it was like, oh, maybe this offense is just going to have a really bad week. But the previous 3 weeks, Jacobs plus Devontae Adams combined for 57 to 63 points. You need about 60 points from them to keep you on a 200-point pace. So we talk about guys who hit that 200-point pace 25% of the time in general. Once out of every 4 games is how DraftKings generally prices guys. Well, these guys have hit 3 straight games in which Devontae Adams has not been dealing with illness. Darren Waller looks like he will still be out. I don't know if that's official just yet. Josh Jacobs gets all the snaps in the backfield. Devontae Adams is the core focal point of the passing attack, and it's a good matchup against Jacksonville. So the reason I say this isn't as great in large field play is because when I look at a block like this, I want to look and see, right, okay, they've combined for 60-ish points. They've combined for a 200-point pace, basically 3 straight games. Do they have room for their touchdowns to still grow? If so, then they would have room to get up to 65 points, 70 points, 75 points, which could be explosive in a large field tournament where you might need 250 points to win, and you kind of need every player to potentially count toward those 250 points. Well, they've been hitting the touchdowns in these 3 games where they were combining for 60. So realistically, if they kind of have negative touchdown regression in this one, then they can end up down at like 54 points, 52 points, 50 points, even with the Raiders having a good game, even with these 2 guys being heavily, heavily involved. That doesn't crush your roster. That's still a solid score from this much in salary. And in most scenarios, they're going to get you around those 55 to 65 points. But in small field play, just getting like points in pocket is so valuable, and saying, okay, now I have 15K of my salary basically locked up toward a 200-point pace, and now I only need to get 7 things right in other spots of my roster. And these other 7 things basically lowers it favors the odds toward me of getting 200 points across this entire roster, because I've got these 60 points in my pocket, these 2 guys, and I've got the rest of my salary to work with, and 7 spots still left on my roster. So you can basically divide 66,000 by 4, and whatever that is, that's about 16,500. So now 1 out of every 16,500 rosters would score 200 plus points just with 7 other random players on this roster. So now then we can find places to kind of increase our edge from there. So that's why I like this building block. Is if things go the way they have for 3 straight games with these guys healthy, you're going to get about 55 to 65 points. If the offense does well, these 2 guys are so central to that offense that they're both going to be doing well. And when Adams scored about 30, Jacobs scored about 30. When Jacobs scored about 37, 38, 39, Adams scored a little bit over 20. So there's kind of some give and take where one guy hits, the other guy doesn't. But both guys kind of move together in that they'll both be putting up points if this offense is doing well.
Yeah, it's kind of, I think we mentioned it on maybe a show earlier this season. I remember it was a few years back where it was AJ Brown and Derrick Henry were actually positively correlated. And conventional wisdom is, hey, if one's getting the touchdowns, the other isn't. But the way the Titans offense functioned, it was so concentrated. And when they did have their big games, both of those guys came along for the ride. And it sounds like that's kind of a similar thesis you have here. Is obviously only one of them will probably have potential for like a 40-point game. Like you're not getting 2 40-point games from these guys. But when the one person does hit that 95th percentile outcome, it's because the offense is doing so well that almost necessarily the other guy's going to have a solid game as well.
Yeah, and that's what's great about a spot like this. We actually, you often reference my Fantasy Life write-up on Fridays. Does it come out on Fridays? Yeah, it comes out on Fridays. And one of the things I talked about this week was being able to see the potential for things to happen before they've ever happened. And so we can go back to 2018 when I was hammering just play Josh Allen every single week with Zay Jones and Robert Foster. It was like 13K in salary, and it kept scoring 45 to 55 points, but they had potential to score way more than that. And 45 to 55 points was keeping you on the 55 pointers were keeping you on an over 200 point pace on cheap guys. They were filling this tough quarterback position deep into the season. And what I kept saying was, look, just play these guys. They're going to keep you on 175 to 200 point pace. But that doesn't mean that that's all they can do. They can have a game where they go way above that. And then we got to week 17 that season against Miami. Josh Allen put up 41 points. The other 2 combined for 40 points. You got 80 points for 13K in salary. So same thing, you brought up the Titans. When they scored those 40-point games, which they did like 4 or 5 times per season across a couple seasons, when they were scoring these 40-point games, or I guess it was like 4 or 5 times across 2 seasons, these 40-point games, AJ Brown and Derrick Henry were both hitting. So there is a scenario here where the Raiders score like 40 points. And that's a lower likelihood scenario. But there is a scenario here where both of these guys actually combine for like 70 plus points. And just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it can't. That's not particularly likely. And that's not the strong value of this pairing. The value is if I get 55 to 60 points in pocket from this much of salary, I'm going to feel great, especially in smaller field play, as this being my starting point. And now I'm kind of way ahead of the field and can mix and match things from there. But yeah, there is actually a viable path to a game scenario in which both of these guys hit for huge games or combine for a huge score. So you're not like blocking yourself out of upside, even in large field play with this pairing.
And so, you know where I'm going with this. We were just talking about bringbacks, game blocks, and we talked about not forcing bringbacks, but we also talked about how much you love Travis Etienne. You clearly like this game. So, but I assume with this block, this is saying I like the Raiders side of this primarily, or how are we now thinking about the Jags in this context?
Yeah, so the Jags they're one of these teams that's interesting. They're kind of like the Chargers, where they're concentrated in the backfield. They're less concentrated than the Chargers, obviously, but they're concentrated in the backfield and then kind of spread out among the pass catchers, to where Christian Kirk has 2 20-point games. Zay Jones has a 20-point game. Marvin Jones has a 20-point game. Evan Ingram had several, like 4 double-digit games at 3,300 in salary. And so it's kind of hard to pinpoint where things go outside of Etienne, but we know that he's going to be involved. So realistically, could the Raiders win 30-17 and no Jags pieces are required? Absolutely. So I don't see this as something where you have to force a bring back, but given what we've talked about so far, this is certainly a spot where it would be like, well, let's put on the guy that we like on this roster and kind of complete this bet where it certainly his chances of a big game are increased a little bit if Jacobs and Adams hit for 60 points, because that probably a game environment where it's like 30-27, something like that. And we can take advantage of that here. But even independent of that, this is just a sharp play. So we're not forcing a correlation. We're playing a guy we like, who's also somewhat correlated to these two guys.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good way to, put things. When I look at, Travis Etienne, I would say maybe alongside a guy like Joe Mixon, probably the best points per dollar value on the slate, showing up in optimal lineups. Not going to be sneaky by any means, but I'll tell you what, there are not going to be a lot of rosters, unless people are duping us here, that have a Josh Jacobs, Devontae Adams, Travis Etienne, because you get the double whammy. Most people don't like to use Jacobs with Adams, and then a lot of people don't like to use 2 running backs from the same game either. So these 3, what's our buzzword? Combinatorial ownership is
combinatorial ownership. Yeah. And nobody listens to us either. People watch us, but they don't listen to us. They don't play what we tell them to play. So you're going to get low ownership on this, where if this game ends up being, which it very easily could end up being, if it ends up being 30-27 or a score in that range, well, you're probably getting a lot of points from this group. And is this the group that's winning you a tournament? Probably not, but you're kind of staying up there near the top, right? And then we need to find the other pieces that can fire us past those remaining rosters and really win the tournament for us from there.
All right. So where would you have us go then here with quarterback? I assume we're not using a Derek Carr or Trevor Lawrence. I'd also assume, I guess I don't want to make an assumption that we wouldn't have a naked quarterback here, but is there a stack or another game that we're now going to go over and target?
Yeah, this is what's fun about this week to me, is there's so many different things we can do at quarterback from this starting point. So I've built probably 60 rosters with these 3 guys on it. And it's mixed and matched with all different quarterbacks. And I'll probably put 20 of those in play in large field play, because like I said, Adams and Jacobs isn't quite as sharp in large field play, but it's basically kind of getting a sense of things and seeing if this is what I'm doing on my main build, which it might be what I'm doing. It's likeliest to be what I'm doing. Who knows at this point though. But then, yeah, there's so many different places we can go at quarterback. So one of the things, let's take what we do know. What we do know is we probably don't have the salary for a super expensive quarterback, because we've already spent up on Jacobs and Adams. So cheaper quarterbacks, then there's a few different ways that we could go. Obviously, we could go Geno Smith, but why go to chalk if we don't feel like it's significantly better than other chalk, or Aaron Rodgers? If we don't think that chalk is significantly better than other chalk, we don't have to go there. It would be tough to fit in Burrow and Higgins, I would imagine. So we can kind of get down to, you actually can go Lawrence. If I went Trevor Lawrence, I would also add Evan Ingram, because like I said, those guys have combined for about 180 point pace in 3 straight weeks. So one of those weeks you have to add James Robinson's score to that. But And then there's touchdowns available still there. Lawrence has only thrown for 2 touchdowns across those 3 games. So still some touchdowns available for Ingram and Etienne there. But we could also go Justin Fields. We could go who can be played naked. You don't need to play him with a wide receiver. And I really like Justin Fields right now. I really like the way that this offense is developing. We could go Mariota and then bring it back with a Chargers piece like Josh Palmer. We could go, like I said, you don't have to have Herbert hitting in order for that Chargers piece to hit. We could go, what other options do we have there? Oh, we can go Heineke and McLaurin. So yeah, those are kind of the places that I would look to go next on this starting point. And again, you could go expensive. There's ways to do this with Herbert or with some other expensive quarterbacks that I've messed around with this week. But I think that the clearest path forward on this starting point is one of these cheaper quarterbacks.
Yeah, you wrote up Justin Fields as a player in the Fantasy Life newsletter, which I know JM mentioned that earlier. Obviously, if you guys aren't subscribed, you should be completely free. And JM has a unique piece in there every Friday with some thoughts. I like the Justin Fields angle here. And then obviously, like you said, you don't have to force a stack. Would you consider Mooney here? Would you consider a Dolphin wide receiver? We talked about how much we like Tyreek Hill. What are some ways that you would think about Fields, or would you potentially use it with no one from Miami and just a completely naked Fields?
You can do any of the above. I think that Fields plus a wide receiver is the lowest percentage way to play this. Fields plus Mooney or Fields plus Claypool is the lowest percentage way to play this. Mooney has never hit with Fields. When Mooney hit last year, it was with Dalton and Foles. Like Mooney has never hit a single time with Fields, which again, doesn't mean that he can't, but the way that this offense is run, this offense is basically, it is becoming the Ravens' early Lamar Jackson offense. They're continuing to adapt more and more concepts. And I don't think people understand what a phenomenal job Luke Getsy is doing with this offense, because it is so difficult to scheme creative run game looks that open up space. Oh God, look how much time we've taken up already. I'll speed this up then. But this offense looks fantastic right now, but it's all run based, right? And so he's going to spread the ball out. He's going to pass, 25 passes. It's going to be a few to Kmet, a few to Mooney. Maybe they'll mix Claypool in for a few to the running backs. They'll do some different things there, but the real piece here is Fields. And I like Fields with a Dolphins bring back. I like Fields naked, and I'll maybe have a little bit of Fields plus a pass catcher, but more of it will be Fields without a pass catcher, and just accounting for the fact that this is a unique slate where we can really get away with doing this. There's no clear top cheap quarterback. So Fields could score 25 to 30. And now Fields could also score 15, right? But he has a lot more upside than he's shown. He could score 25 to 30 and fit really well on a roster like this.
What do you think? Do we have any JM dumpster dive specials if we throw Tyreek in here? Is that going to hamstring us far too much?
If we throw Tyreek in, if we go with the Jets defense, we could actually see what this opens up, right? Jets defense, we're going to have a cheap tight end. We can go at tight end. Is there a cheap tight end that you like this week?
Let me check here. I mean, you can do the Lions one. Brock Wright looks like the best points per dollar punt at 2,500.
Has Brock Wright gotten cleared from the concussion yet?
That's a good question. I have not
Because if not, then James Mitchell is he's a super athletic tight end, and he's a sharp way to go as well. James Mitchell is 2,500. I really like Donald Parham. He was back from his concussion, but he picked up a hamstring injury yesterday and didn't practice. So I'm going to assume right now that he's not going to play.
Okay. Because
hamstring issues are tough. And with that tight offense, I figured they'd go a lot of 2 tight end sets with all the injuries. But yeah, I mean, I like a lot of these cheap guys correlated. Like I like Hayden Hurts on Burrow rosters. I like Ingram on Trevor Lawrence rosters, but I'll probably skip those guys on a roster like this. Oh, Tyler Higbee, 3,700 is going to go overlooked. He's underpriced. But if we want to go really cheap, let's go James Mitchell at 2,500 and assume that he's in over Brock Wright. You could switch this over to Brock Wright, switch this over to Donald Parham, depending on who's available. And now look at that. We've got $5K in salary per position left over. And what's great here is we can choose to either go a couple kind of 5K-ish guys, or we can go with a Terrace Marshall, with a Van Jefferson, and then have a ton of salary left over for our last spot, which is what I would probably do in a spot like this, where we already have Devontae Adams and Josh Jacobs, where we're saying, look, they probably don't get you like a 225-point pace. They probably get you 190, 210-point pace. So who's a guy who can kind of push us over the top? Who's a cheap wide receiver, a Van Jefferson, a Terrace Marshall, a Tyquan Thornton, somebody who's on the field every play and can pick us up some points and then give us another elite player that we can play on this roster.
Yeah. So like if you are down in that range, I'll tell you what, JM, no one is going to play Van Jefferson after what happened last week. I mean, the people were hurt very bad by that one.
He was 50% owned in our bottom up build contest last week. So yeah. Oh, and even after saying that, you typed in Marshall because you're like, I can't play Van Jefferson. No, I mean, here's the thing, man. Van Jefferson, we've seen him. We know who he is.
Yep.
He's going to score 15 to 20 points like in a third of his games. He's also going to disappoint sometimes, but he's going to score some points. And Tampa does not get the pressure that they were getting in the past. They actually, their average depth of target allowed this year is 8.1 yards, where typically they're more toward the bottom of the league in like that 6 to 6.5 yard range. And so with them not getting the pressure, they're allowing these downfield routes to develop a little bit. I like Van Jefferson here. Let's throw him in.
Okay. The only other thing I was going to bring up, you did mention that you do like having a Charger in all of your lineups. We mentioned the Parham. Maybe that's a little sketchy. I see Dave here mentioning DeAndre Carter. Do we need to fulfill your a Charger in every lineup rule?
Yeah, I'm fine with that as well. Let's go ahead and throw in Van Jefferson and see what that gives us in salary. Because if we go to Carter, we end up at like 5,700, which might be the best place to end up in salary, because there's nothing in this. I've had a lot of rosters that have come at this 6.5K range, and I'm like, I like Ramondre Stevenson this week. Mixon is obviously very sharp on paper, but he's also looked pretty awful so far. He's averaging like 3 yards a carry. The offensive line looks awful. It's hard for systems to account for that. He's going to be popular because everybody knows that he projects well. So I'm kind of fine avoiding Mixon. And then if we go down to this like 5,700 range, it's more like 59 where McLaurin is. But if we go down to like the 5,700 range at wide receiver, there are some interesting pieces available with, let's see. Adam Thielen's interesting as a guy who can score 2 touchdowns. Christian Kirk, I guess, is less interesting on this particular build. Realistically, what I would probably do is throw Adam Thielen in on this roster, or I would go down to Van Jefferson and throw in like Joe Mixon or somebody like that.
Yeah. So the Van Jefferson Mixon definitely fits a little cleaner than the DeAndre Carter one there. I guess, I definitely felt a little gross in that 5,700 range. This does seem like a pretty strong roster to me. I know someone in the chat was asking about, projected points versus the ceiling. Just to give you a benchmark, when I ran the ceilings before, it was about a 205 ceiling projection for the optimal with around 150 cumulative ownership. This has 192 ceiling points, what we just built here. So only about 13 points off the optimal and about 50 less ownership percentage points, because Van Jefferson and James Mitchell are clocking in with basically 0 ownership right now.
Yeah, and we get the not a lot of people are going to have Devontae Adams and Tyreek Hill. Not a lot of people are going to have Devontae Adams and Josh Jacobs. So if these pieces are hitting, we're moving a lot of other rosters out of the way because we have things people don't have. So, and then we kind of ride up the field with the chalk on Mixon, with the chalk on Etienne, and it just gives a very unique flavor to this roster. And as far as the Chargers one, it's similar to what we talked about earlier. Like, is the correlation the best thing here? Like, I want a Chargers piece on my rosters. I'm going to have some DeAndre Carter, but how likely is it that Carter is the one from the Chargers who's hitting? Not that likely, right? So if we have to sacrifice our other piece in order to fit in Carter, in order to force that Chargers piece, that's where we have to say, look, we want to do this, but the sharper way to do it is to say Van Jefferson, Carter really doesn't matter here. And so let's get to the guy that we like more and Mixon over Adam Thielen.
I see a question in the chat. I know what your exact answer is going to be. I could answer it word for word, and yet I'm going to still let you answer this. Marcos wants to know, why would you go Van Jefferson over a guy like Michael Bandy, I think the presumed slot wide receiver for the Chargers this weekend?
I want to hear what my exact answer would be. Now I feel pressure.
No. Well, I would say the JM thing is, we know the band of points that you're going to get from a guy like Bandy. And sure, could he give you, a few catches, and could he get 30 to 40 yards and score you 9 to 10 points? Certainly. But how many times is Bandy scoring you 20 plus points? And that is probably a rare outcome compared to a guy like Van Jefferson.
Yeah. And I'll say this too, like DeAndre Carter has 0 games in his career, 113 games played, 0 games in his career over 8 targets, 1 game over 7 targets, 3 games over 6 targets. Like, targets are earned, right? Josh Palmer had 12 targets a couple weeks ago. He's played 23 career games. He has 3 games already north of 8 targets. So targets are earned. So a guy who's not ever seeing the field and is now on the field, I don't suddenly expect him to get a bunch of looks. There are certain situations like a Khalil Shakir where he's somebody who the Bills really like and they're developing him. He was on the field and he got his 5 looks, right? And there were some downfield looks. But yeah, and I might adjust this, right? Because coming into this morning, I expected Parham to be playing, and I was like, man, the Chargers are just going to go a lot of 2 tight end sets. They love Parham. They've got Everett, and now they've got these athletic pieces everywhere. And now it's like, well, what are they going to do? But I don't expect them to make Bandy a focal point of this offense, whereas Josh Palmer probably gets 10 to 12 targets. DeAndre Carter probably gets 5 to 7, and they're going to be more downfield. So I'm not totally averse to a play like that, but I do think that what you're probably getting is like, oh, cool, I got my 8 to 9 points, as opposed to the guy who could actually get you 20 points. So yeah, basically the same answer. But I had to hear it from you first because I hadn't thought through like, what are they going to do without Parham available this week?
You can check your own psychology. I felt gross. I went to start typing in Terrace Marshall over it. And you're gonna look at projected volume for a guy like Terrace Marshall or Bandy compared to a Tyquan Thornton, where we have seen the highs and lows of the Tyquan Thornton experience. It can be at 20 points and it can be, what did he have? 2.2 points last week. But that range of outcomes too. And so when you're hand building, everyone always gravitates to the Bandy, the Marshall, because it just feels safer. They project for more. No one wants to put in a guy in their lineup who could legitimately score 0 points, but that's also offset. I should also mention, like, as usual, people get very caught up in like the specifics of how these lineups end.
Yeah, we're talking about roster construction.
Yeah, JM said he built 60 practice lineups with variations off of that initial core block we just started with. So there are infinite permutations you can have here. This is just a thought exercise for one specific iteration here, JM, but I do think this is a strong lineup and a good kind of frame of reference for how you could start building this week.
It's a roster that can score 200 to 250 points. You can work out that like math on it, right? If Tyreek Hill has this game, if Adams and Jacobs put up 65, if these things happen, it can put up a huge game. And if it's putting up that huge game, it's clearing out other rosters as it does so. It's clearing out your path to first place because it's different enough in other places. It's hurting players in other places and kind of clearing out that path to first place. So yeah, it's a roster that can get to first place. And that's the main thing we want to focus on here is, hey, what's a starting point we can use? And then how could we build a roster that can get to first place? So again, as always, less about the individual players, more about the discussion and what we're doing with the roster. But again, it is a good roster there. So it was fun to do that one.
So you guys, as I said, hop in the Deposit Kingdom Discord, check the announcements channel, get in this rake-free tournament, get signed up over at OWS. You can see how JM's thoughts, like all of ours, they evolve throughout the week as we get more information. We do more practice builds. You can get those thoughts in real time as JM updates all of the content, all of the great contributors over at OWS. Populate the scroll here over the weekend. Any other final parting shots from you, JM, other than we are looking for a sponsorship from LaCroix if they are interested in that.
No, and if anybody wants to sponsor any of my kids' Christmas presents, you guys can also sponsor the show as well. Yeah. I think those are going to get pretty expensive, but no, yeah, we will see you on the site, and we will see you at the top of the leaderboards this weekend.
Sounds good, guys. I will be back as always on Sunday morning for the GPP cram. That is for anyone who's a YouTube member will get access to that. And if you are in the Hand Builders and Opto Bros tier, also get access to a private channel within the Deposit Kingdom Discord. I share leverage plays for every showdown slate. I've been sharing early underdog pick'em thoughts and of course, get you access to that Sunday morning stream. If you have any questions, hit me up. For JM, I'm Pete. We'll see you guys next time.